the untold story of Abraham's two sons, Isaac and Ishmael. For centuries, people have believed they understood the story of Abraham's two sons. It is one of the most familiar narratives in the Bible, repeated in sermons, studied in classrooms, and passed from generation to generation as a defining moment in the history of faith. The story seems simple at first glance. Abraham had two sons. One was the child of promise, the son through whom God's covenant would continue. The other was sent away, a child born under complicated circumstances, destined to grow up far from the center of the family's future. Most readers feel they already know how the story unfolds. Isaac was chosen. Ishmael was rejected. The lines were drawn early, and history moved forward from that division. But the Bible itself tells a more complex story than many people realize. Hidden within the quiet spaces of the text, within small details that are easy to overlook, there are moments that challenge the simple version of the narrative people often assume. These details do not shout for attention. They appear briefly, almost quietly, and then disappear again. Yet when they are noticed, they raise questions that change how the entire story is understood. One of those moments occurs many years after the two brothers were separated. By that time, the lives of Isaac and Ishmael had already moved in different directions. Their childhoods had not been the same. Their paths had not been equal. One remained within the household of Abraham, growing up inside the camp that carried the promise of God. The other had been sent into the wilderness with his mother, forced to build a life far from the place where his story had begun. Everything about their lives suggested distance in geography, distance in inheritance, and distance in destiny. Yet the Bible records a surprising scene. Years later, after the long life of Abraham finally comes to an end, the text briefly describes his burial. The moment is mentioned only in passing, almost as if it were a simple detail meant to close the story of a patriarch. But when the verse is read carefully, something unexpected appears. Isaac and Ishmael are both there. The two brothers stand together at their father's grave. The text does not describe anger between them. It does not mention conflict or accusation. There is no recorded argument, no sign of hostility, no hint of the rivalry that later generations often imagine between them. Instead, the Bible presents a quiet moment, two sons burying their father. It is such a small detail that many readers pass over it without thinking twice. Yet, the more closely it is considered, the more it begins to raise questions. If Isaac and Ishmael were destined to become eternal enemies, why does the Bible never show them fighting each other directly? Why does the story pause, even for a brief moment, to show them standing together at the end of Abraham's life? The silence surrounding that scene is almost as powerful as the words themselves. It suggests that the relationship between these brothers may not be as simple as people often assume. Their story was shaped by decisions, by circumstances, and by events that unfolded long before either of them had the power to control their own fate. To understand what truly happened between them, it is necessary to go back much further to the beginning of their family's story. Long before Isaac and Ishmael were born, before their lives became intertwined with promises and expectations, there was only a man named Abraham and a promise that seemed impossible. Abraham lived in a world very different from the one we know today. It was a world of open landscapes and constant movement, where families traveled with flocks of sheep and goats, setting up tents wherever water and pasture could be found. Cities existed, but many people lived as wandering herders, following ancient routes through deserts and valleys. Life in that world depended heavily on family. A man's future was tied closely to his descendants, and the survival of his household depended on the generations that would come after him. Without children, especially without a son to continue the family line, a man's name could disappear from history in a single generation. By the time the story of Abraham begins to unfold, he was already advanced in years. The strength of youth had long since faded, and the ordinary expectations of life were slowly closing around him. Years had passed without the one thing that ancient families depended on most. He had no son, yet the promise he believed he had received from God spoke of something entirely different. According to the biblical account, God had told Abraham that his descendants would one day become as numerous as the stars in the sky. It was an extraordinary promise, But with each passing year, it also seemed more difficult to believe. Time has a way of testing faith. Promises that once seemed powerful can begin to feel distant when years pass without visible change. The waiting itself becomes a quiet burden, pressing against hope and slowly turning confidence into uncertainty. Abraham was not alone in carrying that weight. His wife Sarah shared the same long years of waiting. Together they had built a life that was stable in many ways. Their flocks had grown, their household had expanded, and their influence among neighboring tribes had increased. Yet the one thing they had hoped for most remained absent. No child had been born to them. In a world where inheritance, identity, and future were tied closely to family lineage, that absence would have been impossible to ignore. Every passing season would have made the promise seem more fragile, and it was within that fragile space between faith and doubt, between promise and reality, that a decision would eventually be made. A decision shaped by human emotions, by cultural customs, and by the deep desire to see the promise fulfilled. That decision would lead to the birth of a boy named Ishmael. Years later, another son would be born, Isaac, the child who arrived when the promise seemed almost impossible to fulfill. But before the rivalry, before the separation, before the silence that followed between these two brothers, their story began in a household filled with waiting. Waiting for a promise, waiting for a future, and waiting for something that seemed, with every passing year, less likely to happen. The world in which Abraham lived was vast, ancient, and constantly moving. It was a landscape defined not by permanent cities and borders, but by open land, shifting routes, and the rhythms of wandering life. Families like Abraham's did not remain in one place for long. They traveled with their flocks, searching for fertile pasture, fresh water, and safe ground where their tents could stand for a season before the journey began again. Across the hills and valleys of the ancient Near East, long caravans of animals and servants moved slowly under the wide sky. The desert stretched outward in every direction, broken only by scattered oases, distant mountains, and the occasional walled settlement where merchants traded goods from lands far beyond the horizon. Life in this world demanded patience and resilience. Survival depended on the land, the weather, and the careful management of herds that provided food, clothing, and wealth. Abraham was not a poor wanderer struggling alone in the wilderness. By the time his story unfolds, he had become the leader of a large household. His camp included not only his immediate family, but also servants, shepherds, workers, and their families. Together they formed a moving community, bound by loyalty and shared responsibility. Wherever Abraham's tents were raised, an entire small world rose with them. Fires burning through the night, animals gathered in enclosures, and voices echoing across the camp as people carried out the routines of daily life. The wealth of a man in this world was measured not in coins or land deeds, but in the size of his herds and the number of people under his protection. By those standards, Abraham was a powerful figure. His flocks had multiplied, his servants were many, and his influence among neighboring tribes was well known. When disputes arose or alliances were needed, his name carried weight. Yet for all his prosperity, there remained one absence that overshadowed everything else. He had no son. In the culture of Abraham's time, this absence was not simply a private sorrow. It had practical consequences that affected the future of the entire household. Without a son to inherit his position, the leadership of Abraham's camp would eventually pass to someone outside his direct line. The wealth he had spent a lifetime building could scatter. The name of his family could slowly fade. For Sarah, his wife, the silence was perhaps even heavier. In the ancient world, motherhood was closely tied to a woman's honor and place within the family. The birth of a child, especially a son, was seen as both a blessing and a confirmation that the household would continue. Years had passed and that moment had never come. Time moved forward relentlessly. Seasons changed. Caravans came and went across the distant trade routes. Children were born into the tents of other families in the camp, their laughter filling the air as they grew older beneath the desert sun. But Abraham and Sarah continued to wait. It was during these long years that Abraham became known for something unusual among the people around him. According to the biblical account, he believed that the God he worshipped had spoken directly to him. not through temples or idols carved from stone, but through a promise that had come to him in moments of quiet certainty. That promise was astonishing in its scope. God had told Abraham that his descendants would one day form a great nation. His family line, which at the moment consisted of no children at all, would multiply until it became too numerous to count. The promise reached far beyond Abraham's own lifetime, stretching into a future he would never personally see. In one passage, the promise is described through a powerful image. Abraham is told to look toward the night sky and count the stars, if such a thing were possible. Just as the stars scatter across the heavens beyond human calculation, so his descendants would one day fill the earth. For a younger man, such a promise might have sounded thrilling. For an old man without a son, it must have sounded almost impossible. Faith in such a promise required patience that stretched across years of silence. Each season that passed without change created a quiet tension between what had been promised and what reality seemed to show. The camp grew larger. The herds multiplied. But the one thing Abraham waited for remained absent. In the background of this waiting, the customs of the ancient world offered possible solutions. Families in Abraham's time had ways of preserving their legacy even when a wife could not bear children. A servant could sometimes become an adopted heir. In other cases, arrangements within the household allowed another woman to bear a child on behalf of the wife, ensuring that the family line would continue. These customs were widely understood and accepted among the surrounding cultures. They were practical responses to a problem that threatened the stability of a household. As the years passed and the promise still seemed distant, those customs would begin to shape the choices made within Abraham's family. Sarah watched time move forward, and the possibility of bearing a child herself seemed to slip further away. Age had begun to take its toll, and what once seemed merely delayed now began to feel unreachable. The promise Abraham believed in still lingered in the background of their lives, but human uncertainty had a way of creeping into the spaces where patience was required. It was within that atmosphere where hope and doubt lived side by side that a decision slowly formed. A decision that followed the customs of their world rather than the patience demanded by the promise. When that decision was finally made, it would bring a child into Abraham's household, a child who would grow up beneath the same desert sky, surrounded by the same tents and herds, and loved as Abraham's own son. His name would be Ishmael. At that moment, the promise seemed closer to fulfillment than it had ever been before. Yet the story of Abraham's family was only beginning to unfold, and the consequences of that decision would echo through the lives of everyone in the camp. Within Abraham's vast household, relationships were shaped not only by affection, but also by the customs and hierarchies of the ancient world. Every person in the camp had a place. Servants, shepherds, guards, and laborers all moved within an ordered structure that kept the wandering community functioning. At the center of that structure stood Abraham and Sarah, the leaders whose authority guided the entire household. Sarah had lived beside Abraham for many years. She had traveled with him across unfamiliar lands, shared the hardships of migration, and watched as their camp slowly grew into a powerful community. She had also carried the quiet weight of childlessness through those years, an absence that became more noticeable as time passed. Among the women who lived within Sarah's household was a younger servant named Hagar. She had come from Egypt and now served Sarah as part of the inner circle of the camp. In that world, servants often lived closely connected to the families they served, sharing the same spaces, the same daily routines, and sometimes even the same emotional tensions that developed within the household. Hagar's life was defined by her position under Sarah's authority. She followed the responsibilities expected of her, helping maintain the complex rhythm of life inside the tents where Abraham's family lived. The days were filled with ordinary tasks: preparing food, managing supplies, tending to the needs of the household, and supporting Sarah in whatever duties were required. Yet within the quiet routines of daily life, the larger question that hung over Abraham's household remained unresolved. Years had continued to pass without the birth of a child to Abraham and Sarah. The promise Abraham believed God had spoken still lingered in the background of their lives, but its fulfillment seemed increasingly distant. For Sarah, the waiting had grown painful. The cultural expectation surrounding motherhood pressed heavily upon her. In the ancient world, a woman's status and security within the household were often closely tied to her ability to bear children. Watching time slip away without that blessing could feel like watching the future itself slowly close. Eventually, Sarah began to consider the customs of her time. Families in the ancient Near East had developed practical ways of dealing with situations like hers. If a wife could not bear a child, it was sometimes acceptable for a servant woman within the household to bear a child on behalf of the wife. The child would still be recognized as part of the family's lineage and could become the heir who carried the household forward. This solution was not unusual in that world. It was an accepted practice within many cultures of the region, a way to protect the future of the family when circumstances seemed to leave no other path. At some point during those long years of waiting, Sarah made a decision that would alter the lives of everyone involved. She turned to Hagar. Sarah approached Abraham with a proposal shaped by the customs of their society. If Hagar were given to Abraham and bore a child, that child could become the son the household needed. The promise that Abraham believed in might finally begin to take form. The decision was deeply human, born from hope, impatience, and the desire to see the future secured. Abraham agreed. Soon afterward, Hagar conceived. For the first time in many years, the camp of Abraham was filled with a new kind of anticipation. The promise of a child had finally appeared within the household. The long silence that had surrounded Abraham's future seemed to be breaking. But human relationships are rarely untouched by such changes. As Hagar's pregnancy progressed, the balance within the household began to shift in subtle ways. Hagar, who had once lived entirely under Sarah's authority, now carried Abraham's child. In the eyes of the surrounding culture, bearing a son for the patriarch of the household elevated a woman's position in ways that could not easily be ignored. The tension between the two women began to grow. The biblical text hints at this change in only a few brief lines, but those lines reveal how quickly the emotional landscape of the household transformed. What had begun as a practical solution soon became a source of conflict. Sarah, who had arranged the situation herself, now found herself living beside the woman who carried Abraham's child. The reality of that arrangement became more difficult to bear as Hagar's pregnancy advanced. Feelings of resentment, jealousy, and humiliation began to surface. For Hagar, the situation was equally complicated. She had not chosen her role in the unfolding events, yet her life had been drawn into the center of a family conflict far larger than herself. The atmosphere within Abraham's household grew strained. Sarah eventually brought her distress to Abraham, expressing the pain the situation had created. The harmony of the camp had been disrupted, and the relationships that once held the household together were beginning to fracture. Abraham, faced with the growing conflict, allowed Sarah to handle the situation as she saw fit. Under Sarah's authority, Hagar experienced harsh treatment that made life in the camp unbearable. The tension that had once existed quietly within the household now erupted into open suffering. Eventually, Hagar fled. Alone and pregnant, she left the safety of Abraham's camp and wandered into the wilderness. The desert that stretched beyond the grazing lands was vast and unforgiving, a place where survival depended on water, shelter, and the presence of others. For a pregnant woman traveling alone, it was a dangerous place to be. Yet the biblical story records that it was there, in the lonely spaces of the wilderness, that something unexpected happened. According to the text, Hagar encountered a divine messenger who spoke to her and revealed that the child she carried would survive and grow into a great people. The message gave the unborn child a name before he was even born: Ishmael. The name carried a meaning that reflected the moment of his mother's suffering. It meant that God had heard her distress. Hagar eventually returned to Abraham's household, and when the child was born, Abraham welcomed him as his son. For the aging patriarch who had waited so long for a child, the birth of Ishmael must have seemed like the beginning of the promise he had hoped for. Years of waiting had finally produced a son, yet the story of Abraham's family was far from complete. The arrival of Ishmael had changed the household forever, but the promise that shaped Abraham's faith had not yet reached its final form. For a time, the birth of Ishmael seemed to settle the question that had lingered over Abraham's household for so many years. The long silence that once surrounded the patriarch's future had been broken by the cry of a child inside the camp. After decades of waiting, Abraham finally had a son. The boy quickly became the center of his father's world. In a culture where lineage and inheritance defined a man's legacy, the presence of a son carried enormous significance. Ishmael was not merely a child growing up among the tents and herds. He represented continuity, the future of Abraham's name, and the possibility that the promise Abraham believed in was finally beginning to unfold. As the years passed, Ishmael grew into a lively boy beneath the open skies of the desert. He would have learned to walk among the animals that filled the camp, following the shepherds as they guided flocks across the surrounding hills. The rhythms of life in Abraham's household became the rhythms of his childhood. Morning fires, the sounds of animals stirring in their enclosures, the distant voices of workers preparing for another day of travel or labor, all of it formed the background of his early years. Abraham watched his son grow with the pride of a father who had waited a lifetime for this moment. By the time Ishmael reached his early teenage years, he had become the obvious heir to everything Abraham possessed. The camp, the flocks, the servants, and the authority that Abraham carried among neighboring tribes would eventually pass to him. From every visible angle, the future seemed clear. Yet the biblical story suggests that the promise God had given Abraham had never been meant to unfold in the way human reasoning had assumed. 13 years passed after Ishmael's birth. 13 years in which Abraham raised the boy as his son and heir, watching him grow stronger and more capable with each passing season. The promise Abraham had once struggled to believe now seemed fulfilled in the most natural way imaginable. But according to the biblical account, something extraordinary happened during those later years. God spoke to Abraham again. The message he received must have been startling. The promise of descendants was reaffirmed, but with a detail that changed everything Abraham thought he understood. The covenant God had spoken about so many years earlier would not continue through Ishmael. Instead, it would come through a son who had not yet been born. The son would come through Sarah. For Abraham, the words must have seemed almost impossible to comprehend. By this time, he was already nearing 100 years of age. Sarah, too, had long passed the years when women typically bore children. The idea that she would now conceive a child defied the natural expectations of life. The biblical text records Abraham responding with a mixture of disbelief and hope. In one moment, he laughed at the sheer impossibility of what he had heard. In another, he pleaded that Ishmael might still be the one through whom the promise would continue, but the answer he received remained unchanged. Sarah herself would bear a son. The announcement would have carried an emotional complexity that rippled through the entire household. For years, Sarah had watched Hagar's son grow into the place she once believed would belong to her own child. Now the future seemed to be shifting again in a direction that few could have expected. When Sarah eventually heard the message that she herself would bear a son, her reaction echoed the same disbelief Abraham had felt earlier. She laughed. The laughter was not joyful at first. It carried the astonishment of someone who had spent decades accepting that motherhood would never come. The idea that her life would now change in such a dramatic way seemed almost beyond belief. Yet time, which had once seemed to close every door, suddenly began to open one that had long appeared impossible. Against every natural expectation, Sarah conceived. The news spread through Abraham's camp with a mixture of wonder and uncertainty. Those who lived within the household had watched the long years of waiting. They had seen Ishmael grow into a young boy who appeared destined to inherit everything Abraham possessed. Now the future of the family seemed to be shifting once again. When the child was finally born, Abraham gave him the name Isaac. The name itself reflected the strange path that had led to his arrival. Isaac meant, "he laughs," a reminder of the disbelief that had greeted the promise when it was first spoken. But this laughter was different now. What once sounded like doubt had become a symbol of astonishment. The impossible had happened. A child had been born to Abraham and Sarah in their old age. A son whose very existence seemed to confirm the promise that had shaped Abraham's life for so many years. For Sarah, the birth of Isaac carried deep emotional meaning. The long years of waiting, the humiliation she had once felt, and the complicated choices that had unfolded within the household were now part of a story that had taken an unexpected turn. The child she held in her arms represented not only the fulfillment of a promise, but also a restoration of hope she had nearly abandoned. For Abraham, the joy of Isaac's birth must have been accompanied by a quiet awareness of what this new arrival meant for the family. Because Ishmael was still there. By the time Isaac was born, Ishmael was already a young teenager. He had spent his entire life growing up as Abraham's only son, the child everyone believed would inherit the future of the household. Now, a new child had arrived, one whose birth carried a promise that seemed to reshape everything. The camp that once celebrated the arrival of Ishmael now celebrated the birth of Isaac. Two sons now lived under Abraham's roof. One had grown into adolescence, shaped by years of life in the camp as Abraham's heir. The other was a newborn child whose future carried the weight of a divine promise that no one fully understood. For a brief moment, the household held both possibilities at once. Yet the presence of two sons, born under such different circumstances, would soon bring the tensions within Abraham's family to the surface in ways that would change the lives of both boys forever. For a time after Isaac's birth, life within Abraham's camp appeared to move forward peacefully. The routines of the household continued as they always had. Shepherds guided flocks across the hills in search of pasture. Servants prepared food beside the evening fires, and the wide desert sky stretched above the tents as it had for generations. Yet beneath that ordinary rhythm, something had quietly shifted. The presence of Isaac changed the balance of the family in ways that could not be ignored. A child had finally been born to Sarah, and that child carried the promise that had shaped Abraham's faith for so many years. What once seemed impossible had become reality, and the household now revolved around the small boy whose arrival had stunned everyone who witnessed it. Sarah watched Isaac grow with the fierce devotion of a mother who had waited a lifetime for her child. Every small milestone in his early years carried meaning that reached beyond the ordinary joys of parenthood. Isaac was not only her son, he was the living proof that the years of waiting had not been in vain. But Isaac was not the only son in the camp. Ishmael had already spent his entire childhood within Abraham's household. By the time Isaac was born, he had grown into a teenager old enough to understand the subtle changes unfolding around him. For years, he had lived with the quiet assumption that he would one day inherit everything his father possessed. The camp, the flocks, the servants, and the authority Abraham carried among neighboring tribes had all seemed destined to pass to him. Now another child stood at the center of the household's attention. The biblical text offers only a brief glimpse of the moment when these tensions finally surfaced, yet the scene it describes is powerful. In ancient families, the weaning of a child was an important milestone. It marked the moment when a baby moved from the fragile stage of infancy into the stronger years of early childhood. The event was often celebrated with a feast, a gathering where family members and servants acknowledged the child's growing strength. When Isaac reached that stage, Abraham held such a celebration. The camp would have been alive with activity. Food was prepared, animals were slaughtered for the meal, and the people who formed Abraham's household gathered to mark the occasion. It was a joyful moment centered on the young boy whose birth had brought such astonishment. But during that celebration, Sarah noticed something. The Bible describes the moment in only a few words. She saw Ishmael, the son of Hagar, interacting with Isaac in a way that troubled her deeply. The Hebrew text suggests laughter or mockery, a behavior that Sarah interpreted as disrespect toward the child she believed carried the promise. Whatever exactly occurred in that moment, it stirred a reaction within Sarah that could no longer be contained. The tensions that had existed quietly within the household since Isaac's birth suddenly came into the open. Sarah turned to Abraham with a demand that must have struck him with painful force. She insisted that Hagar and Ishmael be sent away. In Sarah's eyes, the presence of the older boy threatened the future she believed to belong to Isaac. The inheritance of Abraham's household could not be shared between the two sons. If Isaac was to inherit the promise, Ishmael could not remain within the camp. Her words were direct and uncompromising. The son of the servant woman, she argued, must not share in the inheritance with her own child. For Abraham, the request was deeply distressing. Ishmael was not merely part of the household, he was his son. For 13 years before Isaac's birth, Ishmael had been the only child Abraham had known. The boy had grown up beneath his care, learning the ways of the camp and forming the bond that naturally develops between a father and his child. To send him away was not a simple household decision. It meant severing a part of Abraham's own life. The biblical text does not describe Abraham responding immediately. Instead, it reveals that the situation weighed heavily upon him. The request Sarah had made forced him into a position that seemed impossible to resolve without pain. In the quiet of that struggle, the story records that God spoke to Abraham again. The message he received did not erase the emotional difficulty of the moment, but it clarified the path he was to follow. Isaac, the son born to Sarah, would carry the covenant that had been promised. Through him, the future Abraham had been told about would unfold. Yet the message also contained reassurance about Ishmael. Though he would not inherit the covenant in the same way, Ishmael would not be forgotten. Because he was Abraham's son, God promised that he too would become the father of a great people. The decision before Abraham remained painful, but the direction had been set. Early the next morning, Abraham prepared for the moment he had hoped would never come. He gathered provisions for Hagar and Ishmael bread, and a container of water, and placed them in Hagar's hands. The supplies were simple, the kind travelers carried when moving between settlements across the dry lands of the region. The scene must have unfolded quietly in the early light of day. Hagar stood ready to leave the camp where she had lived for years. Beside her stood Ishmael, no longer a small child, but still young enough to feel the shock of what was happening. The boy who had once been raised as Abraham's heir was now being sent away into the wilderness. With those few supplies, Hagar and Ishmael stepped beyond the boundaries of Abraham's camp and began walking into the vast desert that stretched beyond the grazing lands. Behind them, the tents of the household slowly disappeared from view. Ahead of them lay only the uncertain horizon of the wilderness. The wilderness stretched endlessly before them. Beyond the familiar grazing lands where Abraham's flocks once moved, the terrain became harsher and more unforgiving. The earth turned dry and uneven, broken by scattered stones and patches of thorny scrub that clung stubbornly to the desert soil. The wind moved across the land in slow, restless currents, carrying fine dust that settled over everything it touched. Hagar and Ishmael walked through this vast emptiness with only the supplies Abraham had given them. The small container of water and the bread they carried were enough for a short journey, but the desert was not a place where certainty could be trusted. Distances were difficult to judge beneath the blazing sun, and the horizon seemed to retreat the further one traveled. At first, Hagar likely followed the paths known to travelers moving between settlements in the region of Beersheba. These routes were not clearly marked roads, but familiar directions known by shepherds, traders, and wanderers who had crossed the landscape for generations. Yet even the most experienced traveler could lose their way when the land stretched endlessly in every direction. The days grew hotter and the water began to disappear. The sun hung high in the sky, pouring heat over the barren ground. Each step became heavier than the last, as exhaustion slowly crept into their bodies. Ishmael, who had once lived within the safety of Abraham's camp, was now facing the brutal reality of the wilderness. Eventually, the moment arrived that Hagar must have feared from the beginning. The water was gone. Without water, survival in the desert quickly becomes impossible. The human body weakens under the relentless heat, and strength drains away faster than the traveler expects. Every breath feels heavier. Every step becomes uncertain. Hagar could see that Ishmael was beginning to collapse under the strain. The biblical text describes the moment with heartbreaking simplicity. Realizing that the boy could not continue, Hagar placed him beneath a small desert shrub. The thin branches of the bush offered only the slightest shade against the burning sun, but it was the only shelter she could find. Then she walked away. Not far, only a short distance, but far enough that she would not have to watch what she believed was about to happen. The weight of the situation had become unbearable. The wilderness was silent except for the wind and the faint rustle of dry leaves. Hagar sat down at a distance, overwhelmed by despair. She could not bear to see the child die. The boy lay beneath the fragile shade of the bush, his strength fading in the heat. The future that once seemed secure within Abraham's household now appeared to be dissolving in the vast emptiness of the desert. It was a moment of complete helplessness. But the biblical narrative introduces something unexpected into the silence of that wilderness. The text says that God heard the voice of the boy. The words carry a quiet but powerful meaning. Ishmael's very name reflected this idea. When Hagar had first conceived him, the divine messenger had told her to name him Ishmael, a name that meant God hears. Now, in the moment when his life seemed closest to ending, that meaning returned with surprising force. God had heard the cry of the child in the desert. A divine messenger appeared to Hagar once again, speaking words that broke through the despair that had overwhelmed her. The message reassured her that the boy would not die there in the wilderness. His life would continue, and his future would become far greater than she could imagine in that desperate moment. The promise was simple yet profound. Ishmael would become the father of a great nation. The message carried both comfort and direction. Hagar was told to rise, lift the boy, and continue forward. The story suggests that in that moment, something changed in the way she saw the landscape around her. Nearby, there was a well. Water had been present all along, hidden within the wilderness that had seemed so empty and unforgiving. Hagar filled the container once again and gave the boy something to drink. Strength slowly returned as the immediate danger passed. Life, which had seemed ready to vanish beneath the desert sun, began to return. The story of Ishmael did not end in the wilderness that day. Instead, the desert became the place where his life would truly begin. The biblical text explains that the boy grew up in that harsh landscape. The wilderness shaped him into someone strong enough to survive where others could not. He learned to live beneath the open sky, moving through the same rugged terrain that had nearly taken his life as a child. Over time, Ishmael became known as a skilled archer. The desert, with its wide spaces and constant challenges, formed the environment where his identity took shape. The quiet camps of Abraham's household were now far behind him. The life he built would follow a different path, one rooted in the independence and resilience required to survive in the wilderness. Hagar eventually found a wife for him from her homeland in Egypt, reconnecting the boy to the culture from which she herself had come. Together, they began building a new life beyond the reach of Abraham's tents. Far away, Isaac continued to grow within the household that Ishmael had once called home. The two brothers, whose early lives had briefly overlapped within the same camp, now lived in entirely separate worlds. One grew up among the herds and servants of Abraham's family. The other was shaped by the harsh freedom of the desert. Their lives moved forward on paths that seemed destined never to cross again. Yet the story of Abraham's family was still unfolding. The years would pass, and the distance between the brothers would grow. Their futures would expand into separate peoples and separate histories. But the Bible quietly preserves a moment far in the future when those two paths would meet again in the most unexpected way. Years passed, and time slowly carried Abraham's household into a new chapter of life. The painful departure of Hagar and Ishmael faded into the distance, though it was never completely forgotten. Life in the camp continued to move with the familiar rhythm of seasons, travel, and the quiet routines that defined the lives of wandering families. At the center of that world, Isaac grew from infancy into childhood. The boy who had once been cradled in Sarah's arms now began to run through the open spaces between the tents. His laughter echoed through the camp as he played among the servants' children and followed the shepherds who tended Abraham's flocks. For Abraham and Sarah, every moment of Isaac's growth carried a quiet sense of wonder. The child they had believed would never exist had become the living center of their lives. Sarah watched her son with the protective care of a mother who knew how fragile hope could be. She had waited for Isaac longer than most people waited for anything in their lives. Now that he was there, every step of his childhood felt precious. Abraham, too, looked at the boy with a deep mixture of affection and reflection. Isaac was more than a beloved son. He represented the continuation of a promise that had shaped Abraham's entire journey. From the moment God had first spoken to him about descendants as numerous as the stars, Abraham had carried that promise through decades of uncertainty. Now the promise had a face. Yet as Isaac grew older, another moment arrived that would test Abraham in a way far deeper than the years of waiting ever had. One day, according to the biblical account, God spoke to Abraham again. The message he received was unlike anything he had heard before. God called Abraham to take Isaac, the son he loved, and travel to a distant mountain in the land of Moriah. There, Abraham was told to offer the boy as a sacrifice. The command must have struck Abraham with a shock that words can barely capture. Isaac was not only his son, he was the child through whom the promise was meant to continue. Every hope about the future of Abraham's family rested on the life of that boy. Yet the message left no room for misunderstanding. The journey had to be made. The biblical text describes Abraham rising early the next morning. The quiet determination in that detail is striking. He prepared the supplies needed for the journeywood for the offering, provisions for travel, and set out with Isaac and 2 servants. The small group began moving through the rugged landscape, leaving the familiar grounds of the camp behind them. The journey lasted several days, giving Abraham time to reflect on the command he had received and the weight of what lay ahead. Isaac walked beside his father, unaware of the full meaning of the journey they were making together. By the time they reached the mountain God had shown Abraham, the moment could no longer be delayed. Abraham told the servants to remain behind while he and Isaac continued upward alone. Father and son climbed the mountain together. Isaac carried the wood for the offering while Abraham held the fire and the knife. As they walked, the boy noticed something missing. The supplies for a sacrifice were incomplete. He turned to his father and asked a simple question. "Where is the lamb for the offering?" The question must have pierced Abraham's heart. For a moment, the entire weight of the journey rested in that single conversation between father and son. Yet Abraham responded with quiet faith. God himself will provide the lamb. They continued walking until they reached the place where the altar was to be built. Abraham arranged the wood carefully, creating the structure that would hold the offering. Then came the moment that is echoed through centuries of readers. Abraham bound Isaac and placed him on the altar. The scene carries a deep tension that runs through the entire story. The promise that had once seemed impossible now faced the moment that threatened to erase it completely. Abraham raised the knife, prepared to carry out the command he had been given. But just as the moment reached its climax, a voice called out from heaven. The divine messenger stopped Abraham before the act could be completed. The command had never been meant to end Isaac's life. Instead, it revealed the depth of Abraham's faith, the willingness to trust the promise even when circumstances seemed to contradict it. Nearby, caught in a thicket, there was a ram. The animal became the sacrifice in Isaac's place. The mountain that had begun as a place of fear became a place of relief and gratitude. Isaac's life was spared, and the promise that rested upon him remained intact. The story became one of the most powerful demonstrations of faith in the entire biblical narrative. Abraham's trust had been tested in the most profound way imaginable, and the outcome reaffirmed the covenant that had guided his life. After the event on the mountain, Abraham and Isaac returned to the camp. Life continued, and the years moved forward once again. Isaac grew into adulthood, learning the responsibilities that would one day fall upon him. The household of Abraham remained strong, its flocks spreading across wide stretches of land, its influence known among the surrounding tribes. But far beyond the boundaries of Abraham's camp, another life was unfolding. In the wilderness, Ishmael had grown into a man shaped by the desert. The boy who once lay beneath a desert shrub, close to death, had survived and built a future far from the place where his story began. The 2 brothers, separated by circumstance and destiny, now lived in different worlds. Their lives moved forward on paths that seemed unlikely to meet again. Time continued its quiet work, carrying the lives of Abraham and his family deeper into the years. The long journeys across the land grew fewer as age slowly settled over the patriarch, who had once wandered through distant territories following a promise that seemed larger than life itself. The camp that had moved so often in earlier days now lingered longer in familiar places, and the pace of life within Abraham's household softened with the passing seasons. Isaac had grown into a young man. The child whose birth once astonished everyone around him now carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone preparing to inherit responsibility. Abraham had spent years guiding him, teaching him how to manage the flocks, how to speak with neighboring tribes, and how to lead the large household that would one day depend on his decisions. Sarah, who had waited so long to hold her son, watched those changes with both pride and tenderness. Isaac's laughter still filled the camp, but it now carried the deeper voice of a young man stepping slowly into adulthood. Then one day, the long story of Sarah's life came to an end. She died at the age of 127, leaving behind the son she had once believed she would never see. Her death brought a moment of profound grief to Abraham's household. For decades, she had been the matriarch of the camp, a presence whose strength and determination had shaped the family's journey from the beginning. The biblical account describes Abraham mourning deeply for her. The loss carried the weight of many shared years filled with travel, waiting, hope, and struggle. The woman who had once laughed in disbelief at the promise of a child had lived long enough to see that promise fulfilled. Her death also forced Abraham to confront a practical reality that he had not yet faced. Throughout his long life of wandering, he had never owned a permanent piece of land in the region where he lived. The pastures where his flocks grazed were borrowed through agreements with local tribes. The places where his tent stood were temporary, shifting with the seasons. But now he needed a burial place. Determined to honor Sarah properly, Abraham approached the people of the land, the Hittites, who lived nearby, and asked to purchase a small piece of ground where he could lay his wife to rest. The request carried humility, even though Abraham himself was widely respected among the surrounding communities. The Hittites responded with generosity, offering him the choice of their burial places. But Abraham insisted on purchasing a specific piece of land rather than accepting it as a gift. The place he chose was a cave in a field owned by a man named Ephron. After a formal negotiation carried out according to the customs of the time, Abraham paid the full price for the field and the cave within it. The location became the first piece of land that Abraham's family truly owned in the region where they had spent so many years wandering. There, in the cave of Machpelah, Sarah was buried. The moment carried symbolic meaning beyond the sorrow of her death. The land that Abraham purchased became more than a burial place. It was a quiet foothold in the land connected to the promise he had followed for so long. Though he had lived much of his life as a traveler, this small piece of ground would remain connected to his family for generations. After Sarah's burial, the camp slowly returned to the rhythms of daily life. Yet Abraham knew that his own years were drawing toward their final chapter. One of the responsibilities that weighed most heavily on him was securing Isaac's future. Isaac was now the heir to everything Abraham possessed, but the young man had not yet taken a wife. In the ancient world, marriage was more than a personal relationship. It was a bond between families that shaped the future of entire households. Abraham wanted to ensure that Isaac's marriage would align with the values and traditions of the family. He turned to his most trusted servant and gave him an important mission. The servant was to travel back to the region where Abraham's extended family lived and find a suitable wife for Isaac from among their relatives. Abraham was determined that Isaac would not marry from the surrounding tribes of the land where they currently lived. The servant accepted the task and set out on the long journey north, carrying gifts and provisions for the search. After traveling many miles, he arrived near the town where Abraham's relatives lived. There, beside a well where women came each evening to draw water, the servant prayed quietly for guidance. He asked that the woman chosen for Isaac would reveal herself through a simple act of kindness, offering water, not only to him but also to the camels he had brought with him. The request seemed almost impossible. Watering a group of thirsty camels required tremendous effort, drawing bucket after bucket from the well. Yet the servant trusted that the right person would reveal herself through generosity and compassion. Soon afterward, a young woman named Rebecca arrived at the well. Without hesitation, she offered the traveler water and then volunteered to draw water for all the camels until they had finished drinking. The task must have taken considerable time and strength, yet she carried it out willingly. The servant recognized the moment as an answer to his prayer. Rebekah belonged to Abraham's extended family, and her kindness confirmed that she was the right person for Isaac. After explaining his mission to her family, arrangements were made for her to return with him and become Isaac's wife. When Rebekah finally arrived at Abraham's camp, Isaac went out into the fields to meet her. Their marriage marked the beginning of the next generation within the family that had grown from Abraham's long journey of faith. Life continued to unfold across the land, the story moving quietly forward. Yet far beyond the fields and tents where Isaac now lived with his new wife, another part of Abraham's family still existed in the wide spaces of the desert. Ishmael, the son who had once left the camp as a boy, had grown into a man whose life followed a different path. The years had shaped him in ways very different from the brother who remained within Abraham's household. The distance between them had stretched across decades, but the story of their father had not yet reached its final moment. The years continued to pass, and the long life of Abraham slowly approached its final chapter. By this time, he had lived longer than most men of his generation. The journey that began decades earlier with a single promise had carried him across distant lands, through seasons of waiting, and into moments of joy and pain that shaped the destiny of his family. Isaac was now fully grown, married to Rebekah, and beginning to take on the responsibilities that would one day belong entirely to him. The household Abraham had built over the course of many years still stretched across the land with its flocks, servants, and tents. But the weight of leadership was gradually shifting toward the next generation. Yet Abraham's life did not grow quiet immediately after Isaac's marriage. The biblical account reveals that he took another wife named Keturah. Through her, Abraham had several more sons. These children became the ancestors of various tribes that would eventually spread across regions of the Arabian desert. Their presence added new branches to Abraham's growing family, expanding the network of peoples who traced their origins back to him. Even so, the central inheritance of Abraham's household remained focused on Isaac. Before his death, Abraham made careful decisions about how his possessions and responsibilities would be divided. The sons born through Keturah received gifts and were sent eastward, away from the central camp. These decisions ensured that Isaac would remain the primary heir, carrying forward the line through which the covenant promise was meant to continue. By this stage in his life, Abraham must have reflected often on the path his story had taken. He had once left his homeland with little more than a promise that his descendants would become a great people. For many years, that promise seemed fragile, almost impossible to believe. Yet now his family had grown into multiple branches, spreading outward across the land in different directions. The quiet waiting that once defined his life had been replaced by the complex reality of a family that would continue long after he was gone. Eventually, the moment arrived when Abraham's life came to an end. The Bible records that he died at the age of 175 years. It describes his death with a sense of peaceful completion, saying that he died at a good old age, having lived a full life before being gathered to his people. What happened next is described in a single verse, yet that verse carries a remarkable detail. Abraham was buried in the cave of Machpelah, the same place where Sarah had been laid to rest years earlier. The burial site lay within the field he had purchased from the Hittites, the first piece of land his family had ever owned in the region. But the text does not say that Isaac alone carried out the burial. It says that Isaac and Ishmael buried their father together. The brief statement appears almost quietly within the narrative, yet its meaning is difficult to ignore. The two brothers who had once grown up under the same roof, who had been separated by circumstances that reshaped their lives, were now standing side by side at the end of their father's story. Decades had passed since Ishmael walked away from Abraham's camp as a boy beside his mother. In that time, the brothers had lived completely separate lives. Isaac remained within the household that carried the covenant promise. Ishmael grew into the father of tribes that spread across the wilderness. Their worlds had become distant from one another in almost every possible way, and yet, when Abraham died, both sons appeared. The Bible does not explain how the meeting took place. It does not describe the journey Ishmael made to reach the burial site, nor does it tell us what words, if any, were exchanged between the two brothers when they saw each other again. Instead, the story simply presents the image: Isaac and Ishmael standing together beside the grave of the man who was father to them both. The silence surrounding that moment leaves much to the imagination. Years of separation had passed since they last lived within the same household. The memory of their childhood together would have been distant by then, overshadowed by the lives each had built in different parts of the land. Yet the bond of their father remained. Together they placed Abraham in the burial cave, beside the woman who had shared the long journey of his life. The cave of Machpelah, which Abraham once purchased in sorrow after Sarah's death, now became the resting place of the patriarch himself. The burial closed the story of the man whose faith had shaped the future of generations. After that moment, the narrative of the Bible shifts its focus almost entirely toward Isaac and the line that would continue through him. The covenant promise that began with Abraham moved forward through his younger son, shaping the history that would follow in the chapters ahead. But Ishmael's story did not disappear. The Bible briefly records that Ishmael lived to be 137 years old. His descendants became leaders of 12 tribes, spreading across the desert regions stretching from Havilah to Shur. Their lives unfolded across trade routes and wilderness territories, forming communities that carried their own identity and history. In this way, the two sons of Abraham each became the fathers of peoples who would grow and expand across the ancient world. Their lives had begun within the same household, shaped by the decisions of their parents and the unfolding of a promise that neither of them fully understood as children. Then their paths separated. Yet, at the end of Abraham's life, the Bible preserves that quiet scene where the brothers stood together once more. 2 sons, 1 grave, and a moment that hints at something deeper than the rivalry many later generations would imagine. The story of Abraham's 2 sons often feels unfinished in the minds of many readers. For generations, people have looked at Isaac and Ishmael and assumed their lives represent the beginning of an endless rivalry. The narrative is frequently told as the origin of permanent conflict, as though the brothers themselves stood on opposite sides of history from the moment they were born. Yet when the biblical text is read carefully, something very different begins to emerge. The lives of Isaac and Ishmael were shaped by decisions that neither of them made. Before either boy had the power to choose his own path, their futures were already being formed by the complicated circumstances of their parents' lives. Sarah's long years of waiting, Hagar's unexpected role within the household, Abraham's struggle to understand the promise he believed God had given him. These were the forces that created the separation between the brothers. Isaac did not ask to be born into the center of the covenant promise. Ishmael did not choose to grow up outside the camp that once felt like home. Their lives unfolded along different roads because of events that began long before they were old enough to understand them. One brother grew up surrounded by the structure of Abraham's household. The responsibilities of inheritance, leadership, and faith slowly shaped the direction of Isaac's life. His future became connected to the covenant that the Bible describes as passing from Abraham to the generations that followed. The other brother was shaped by the wilderness. The desert became Ishmael's world. Its wide spaces demanded strength and independence. In that harsh landscape, he built a life that carried its own future, one that the Bible itself acknowledges with a promise that his descendants would become a great people. 2 brothers, 2 destinies, 2 very different worlds. Yet the Bible never shows them standing face to face as enemies. The narrative contains no recorded battle between them, no confrontation where the brothers themselves declare hostility toward each other, no moment where their relationship becomes the source of the conflict later generations often imagine. Instead, the story quietly moves forward through years of separation. Isaac marries and begins building the next generation of Abraham's family. Ishmael grows into a leader among the tribes of the desert. The lives of both men expand beyond the place where their childhood story began. Then the Bible presents that final scene. When Abraham dies, the narrative pauses for a single verse that many readers overlook. It says that Isaac and Ishmael buried their father together. The verse appears almost quietly within the text, yet its meaning carries remarkable weight. After decades of living in separate worlds, the two brothers return to the same place. They stand beside the same grave. They carry the same responsibility of honoring the man who gave them life. The Bible does not describe tension in that moment. It does not present anger or accusation. It simply shows the two sons of Abraham fulfilling the same duty side by side. It is a scene of quiet closure. In that moment, the story that began with rivalry, uncertainty, and painful separation ends with something far more complex than many people expect. Two brothers who once shared a household. Two lives shaped by the decisions of others. Two paths that carried them in completely different directions, yet both still connected to the same Father, standing together at the end of his life. The detail is easy to miss, but when it is noticed, it invites a deeper reflection on the entire narrative. The story of Isaac and Ishmael is not simply about rejection and replacement. It is also about how human choices, divine promises, and personal destinies can intertwine in ways that are far more complicated than simple conflict. Isaac continued the covenant line through which the biblical story would move forward. His descendants would form the nation that carried the traditions and scriptures of Israel. But Ishmael's story did not vanish into silence. The Bible itself records that he became the father of 12 princes, leaders of tribes who spread across the deserts of the ancient Near East. His life was not the end of a story, but the beginning of another one. Both sons lived long lives. Both became fathers of peoples who would fill large parts of the ancient world, and both, in the final moment recorded about their relationship, stood together to bury the man whose faith had shaped their beginnings. That quiet scene at Abraham's grave may be one of the most overlooked moments in the entire story, because it suggests something important about the way the Bible presents its characters. Even within stories filled with tension, misunderstanding, and painful decisions, the text often leaves space for moments of unexpected connection. The lives of Isaac and Ishmael began within the same family. They were separated by circumstances they could not control. Yet, at the end of Abraham's life, their paths crossed once more in a moment that required neither rivalry nor competition only, the shared recognition that they were both sons of the same father. And perhaps that small, easily missed detail reveals something deeper about the story itself. Not every division in history begins with hatred. Sometimes it begins with human choices, complicated relationships, and the long unfolding of lives that no one fully understands at the beginning. The story of Abraham's two sons reminds us that behind every great narrative of nations and peoples, there were once simply individuals, brothers, parents, and families trying to navigate the uncertain space between promise and reality.